23rd of November 1658, a solemn procession wended its way through the silent streets of London towards Westminster Abbey. It was the funeral procession of the most powerful ruler the British Isles had known since the fall of Rome. This latter-day emperor had achieved what had eluded the greatest warrior kings of the Middle Ages, welding the countries of England, Scotland and Ireland into one united kingdom. He had bent Parliament to his will, levied taxes as he pleased, stilled the fratricidal religious conflict of the Reformation, and created the most feared navy and army in Europe. He lay in his robe of state, a sceptre in one hand, an orb in the other, with an imperial crown laid on a velvet cushion a little above his head. Yet this ruler was not a king. He was instead a regicide, a king killer. His name was Oliver Cromwell. His story is the tale of how England abolished its age-old monarchy, only to find that it couldn't do without it after all. England, 1644. For 2 years, the country had been embroiled in a bloody civil war between King Charles I and Parliament. The issues in dispute were taxation, the army and the church. Charles had yielded tax-raising to Parliament, but he wouldn't surrender his powers as Commander-in-Chief, still less his God-given right as Supreme Governor of the Church of England to appoint its bishops and regulate its worship according to his own ceremonious beliefs. Because of the importance Charles and his followers attached to bishops, they became known as Episcopalians, from the Latin for bishops. Charles's opponents felt equally strongly against bishops and ceremonies, which meant there was nothing for it but to fight. But after a dozen battles and thousands dead, the war had bogged down. For the parliamentarians, the stalemate provoked crisis and soul-searching. Matters came to a head in 1644 when two leading parliamentary generals, Edward Montague, Earl of Manchester, and his up-and-coming deputy, Oliver Cromwell, each sought to have the other dismissed. For they differed irreconcilably about tactics, war aims, and, above all, about religion. Were they fighting the king to crush him, or merely to bring him to the negotiating table? The latter was Manchester's view. Aristocrat that he was, he couldn't conceive of a kingless world. He also had a thoroughly realistic fear of Charles's residual authority. If we fight the king 100 times and beat him 99, he will be king still, he said. But if he beat us once or the last time, we shall be hanged, we shall lose our estates, and our posterities will be undone. Manchester reflected the views of the majority religious faction in Parliament, the Presbyterians. They wanted a church stripped of Charles's ceremonies, which they hated as popish, and ruled not by bishops under the king, but by assemblies of clergy, known as presbyteries. But there was another, even more radical position. These men, and women too, since religion was one of the few areas of public policy where women were free to express themselves, rejected all human authority in religion and all fixed outward forms of worship. Instead, they believed in their Christian liberty in association only with other like-minded individuals, to seek after truth and to follow the Holy Spirit wherever it led them, personally and individually. Hence the various names by which they were known: independents, separatists, seekers. And one such seeker was Oliver Cromwell himself. Cromwell, Manchester's opponent in the clash of 1644, had been born in 1599. Protestantism was in his blood, and it was further drummed into him, indeed beaten into him, at school and university. Like many religious men, Cromwell experienced a crisis of faith in his 30s, from which he emerged with a burning confidence in his own salvation. He was a big, bony, practical, rather awkward man, hands-on, sporty, unscholarly despite his Cambridge days, but with the gift of the gab and a knack for popular leadership. Fearless, no respecter of persons however grand or institutions however venerable, Cromwell was a man waiting for God to reveal himself to him in action. And what God revealed in Cromwell's own astonishing transformation from country squire to brilliant general was that Charles must be defeated and forced to accept Parliament's terms. Instead, Cromwell insinuated, Manchester's belief in a negotiated settlement had led him to pull his punches on the battlefield. But Cromwell went further. Not only must parliamentary generals be imbued with a new will to victory, there must also be a fundamental reform of the existing parliamentary forces. Cromwell's arguments carried the day, and the result was the creation in February 1645 of the new model army. This was England's first truly professional fighting force, properly paid and equipped by Parliament, and organised on the revolutionary principle that its officers be chosen by merit rather than social rank. The first great test of the new model army came here at Naseby on the 14th of June 1645. On the royalist side was the flower of English chivalry, led by King Charles himself in gilt armour and mounted on his beautiful Flemish horse. In contrast, the parliamentarians were a drab and uniform company, in Cromwell's own words, of poor, prayerful men. The solid ranks of Cromwell's new model cavalry proved decisive. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Charles had lost his infantry, his artillery, and, in effect, the kingdom. God would, Cromwell wrote after the battle, by things which are not, bring to nothing things that are. It was a biblically inspired messianic confidence which Cromwell shared with his troops. The new model army proved to be the decisive weapon in Parliament's struggle with the king. But in forging this weapon, Parliament had called into being a new power in the land, and one whose strength would grow with each victory that it won. After the battle, the army was visited by a clergyman, Richard Baxter. Baxter was a noted Presbyterian who had preached against the king's religious policy. Nevertheless, like most Englishmen, he anticipated that the king would eventually agree to a negotiated settlement and consent to a reformation of the national church on Presbyterian lines. But Baxter now encountered in the new model army a body of men among whom the radical ideas of the religious independence had taken root. These tough, Bible-quoting, disputatious soldiers were agreed on two things: that the state had no right to interfere in the church, and that Charles was a tyrant and a traitor who must be defeated and brought to account for his crimes. For the Presbyterian Baxter, who believed in a God-ordained order and discipline, this was a nightmarish vision of unchristian anarchy. But it was also a vision, Baxter realized, that the men of the new model were determined to turn into a reality. Thanks to the strength of the new model army, what was there to stop them? On the 7th of June, 1647, Charles I met his nemesis, Oliver Cromwell, for the first time, when Cromwell and the other army leaders came to offer the king a deal. Following his defeat in the Civil War, Charles was now Parliament's prisoner, but he found himself in an unexpectedly favourable position, for the divisions among his enemies were becoming wider by the day. The Presbyterians in Parliament, like their allies, the Scottish Covenanters, wanted to impose their form of religion on the whole nation, whereas the Independents in the army wanted an end to religious prescription and the toleration of all forms of worship, so long as they were Protestant. Both sides knew that to swing things their way, they needed the political legitimacy which only God's anointed sovereign could command. Hence the deal offered by the army. It was a triangular game in which the king seemed to hold the strongest hand. But Charles characteristically overplayed it, rejecting the astonishingly lenient political terms he was offered by Cromwell and the other army leaders in order to guarantee religious toleration. Instead, in a cynical renversement d'alliance, the king joined forces with his original enemies, the Scots Covenanters, in return for the king's promise, which he'd no intention whatever of keeping, to impose Presbyterianism throughout the British Isles. The Scots invaded England to restore King Charles I and to wipe out the new model army with its damnable belief in religious toleration. But in August 1648, the Second Civil War, as it became known, came to a bloody end in a 3-day battle at Preston. This was Cromwell's first engagement in sole command of the new model army, and he showed his tactical genius by manoeuvring to cut off the Scots' retreat, thus turning a defeat into an annihilating rout. "Take courage," Cromwell wrote to Parliament after the battle, "to do the work of the Lord." In fact, terrified by the army and its radical religious views, Parliament was seeking to make a peace with Charles, which sold the pass on all the main issues of the war. Double-crossed by both King and Parliament, the Army's Council of Officers now decided to strike down both. On the 1st of December, the army seized the king. On the 6th, Colonel Pride entered the House of Commons and purged it of the 150-strong Presbyterian majority. The Rump, as it was now known, of 50 independents, now proclaimed itself the supreme power in the nation, with the authority to pass Acts of Parliament without the consent of the King or the House of Lords. The Second Civil War and Cromwell's great victory at Preston produced a marked hardening in his attitudes, especially towards the king. Henceforward, Cromwell saw Charles, who'd engineered the war on his own initiative and for his own selfish ends, as a man of blood who must be punished for his crimes. Cromwell's view of his own role also took on a larger compass. Thinking biblically, as always, he saw himself as Gideon, the Jewish farmer summoned from the plough to lead the armies of Israel against the Midianites and to kill their kings. On the 20th of January 1649, King Charles I was brought here to Westminster Hall to be tried for high treason. Charles's strategy, which he stuck to with dogged persistence, was to refuse to recognise either the authority or the legality of the court. And throughout the week-long trial, both the king and his judges sat with their hats firmly on their heads in a standoff of mutual disrespect. But with the army and the radicals in Parliament in control, the verdict was never in serious doubt. This is the death warrant of Charles I, signed and sealed by 59 of his judges, and ordering his execution by the severing of his head from his body on the 30th of January 1649, with its requirement that the execution should take place in the open street before Whitehall. It's a bold and brave document. But it also highlights the titanic effort of will that was needed to bring even this panel of committed parliamentarians to take the terrible, irrevocable step of publicly executing a king. Both the date of the warrant itself and the date of the execution have been inserted over erasures. Two of the names of the men who were in charge of the execution have been changed following the refusal of the original nominees, and many of the signatures we know were only obtained after long, hard lobbying. Overseeing it all, driving it all, and allegedly even guiding the pens of the reluctant signers was the third man to sign, Oliver Cromwell. The 30th of January was bitterly cold. Charles put on 2 shirts, for he didn't want to be seen shivering, lest onlookers mistake it as a sign of fear. At about noon, Charles drank a small glass of claret and ate a little bread. Then he was escorted through the banqueting house here at Whitehall, the scene of the gaudy triumphs of the Stuart court, and stepped through one of the windows onto the high black draped scaffold in the street below. I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, the king said to his chaplain, Bishop Juxon, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance in the world. Then the king removed from his neck the garter jewel of St. George, made from a single onyx encircled with diamonds, and handed it to Juxon with the instruction that it should be given to the Prince of Wales with the one word, remember. Charles's most valuable legacy to his son proved to be the manner of his death. 60 years previously, Charles's grandmother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had died flamboyantly as a passionate martyr to the Catholic faith. Charles instead, with quiet dignity, offered himself up as a sacrifice to his vision of Christian kingship. On the 17th of March 1649, the House of Commons passed an act abolishing the office of king on the grounds that it was unnecessary, burdensome and dangerous to the liberty, safety and public interest of the people. The imperial crown itself was smashed, and an attempt was even made to eradicate the very word king from the language. But getting rid of kings was easier said than done. There had been kings in England since before England itself had existed. Kings had made England, and they had forged the imperial crown with its claim to rule, church as well as state, and Scotland as well as England. Could this king-made, king-centred country successfully become a kingless republic? In 11 years of audacious political experiment, the parliamentarians were determined to try. The parliamentarians' first problem was that in killing one king, they'd created another. He was Charles, Prince of Wales, who'd escaped into exile after the Royalist defeat. Now, with his father's execution, in Royalist eyes, he automatically succeeded as King Charles II. But to make his title real, he needed an army. Monarchs and rulers throughout Europe all expressed their horror at the English regicide, but none was willing to supply a single soldier to help Charles regain his throne. Only the Scots were ready for that, and then only on terms which Charles II found profoundly distasteful, both personally and politically. For Charles, the Scots demanded, must not only accept the Presbyterian Kirk in Scotland itself, he must also promise to impose the Presbyterian system in England and Ireland as well. For 18 months, Charles wriggled, until finally he was forced to accept the inevitable, swear the covenant, and give the undertakings the Scots demanded. The result was that in 1650, Charles Stuart rode once more at the head of an army on British soil. But it was a Scots army dedicated to the imposition of a Scottish Presbyterian empire by force throughout the British Isles. So far, Scotland had been a major independent player in the British Civil Wars and had repeatedly launched armies against England, with decisive consequences for English politics. Now, in two great victories, Cromwell smashed Scotland's ambition and independence. At Dunbar, he took on an army twice his size, killing 3,000 and capturing 10. Then he lured the Scots into England and, at Worcester, caught them in a pincer movement which destroyed the Scots army and nobility. Charles II, who'd been crowned King of Scots on New Year's Day 1651, escaped by hiding in an oak tree. Otherwise, Cromwell's victory was complete. Scotland was conquered, occupied by an English army, and the General Assembly of the Kirk dissolved by force. It was Cromwell's last battle as an active commander, now leaving his friend, General Monk, to mop up in Scotland. He started the journey back to London. Cromwell now, like Julius Caesar before him, bestrode the world like a colossus. He'd outdone the greatest of the medieval kings, and had succeeded where even King Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, had failed. He had conquered Scotland and Ireland, and in a series of coruscating victories had forged a new, united Britain. Except, curiously, in England. For the government of England remained in the limbo which had followed Charles's execution. The king had gone, but it was unclear what would replace him. By 1653, England had been without a king for nearly 5 years, and a decade of war had left the country economically drained. But the Rump Parliament proved incapable of producing either a new reformed constitution or of providing effective leadership. Indeed, by refusing to stand for re-election and meeting in almost continuous session, its members threatened to become a permanent and self-perpetuating oligarchy. Was it for this that the army had brought down Charles I? The last straw came when the Rump began moves to deprive Cromwell himself of his position as Commander-in-Chief. On the 20th of April, Cromwell entered the Commons, dressed as a mere citizen in a plain black coat and with grey worsted stockings. He rose to address the House, putting off his hat as was then customary and speaking moderately in praise of parliaments. But as his passion and his confidence rose, he began to pace up and down, put his hat back on his head and thundered, "You are no parliament. I say, you are no parliament. I will put an end to your sitting. Call them in," he cried. Call them in. Members of Cromwell's regiment burst into the Commons. The Speaker was removed from his chair, the mace from the table, and the members of the Rump dispersed. England had already lost her king. Now it had lost her parliament, and power flowed, unmitigated and undisguised, from the barrel of a musket. Now Cromwell, with the backing of the army, ruled England without parliament as mere commander-in-chief. This portrait of Cromwell, painted shortly after Charles I's execution, shows how far Cromwell, the erstwhile gentleman farmer, had transmuted into a princely figure, in armour, wielding a field marshal's baton, and able to exercise supreme power in civil as well as military affairs. But Cromwell was a reluctant revolutionary and was eager to cloak his military dictatorship in decent constitutional garb, as was the army. And the ruling council of officers drew up a new written constitution, the instrument of government. This was essentially the same deal that the army had offered to Charles I in 1647. 7 years later, Cromwell accepted what Charles had declined. His office was even named Lord Protector or Regent. Cromwell then summoned a parliament as provided for by the Constitution. But the Parliament of Cromwell immediately picked up where the parliaments of Charles I had left off, by arguing about the Lord Protector's control of the army, his income, and his right to appoint advisers. And Cromwell responded by behaving also like Charles I, first denouncing Parliament and then dissolving it. But in trying to rule without a parliament, Cromwell was more than ever thrown into the arms of the army and was obliged as far as possible to satisfy its demands. Cromwell's most dramatic concession to the army came in 1655 with his agreement to the appointment of 11 major generals as military governors of the English regions. The major generals were doubly unpopular. First, because they were responsible for the enforcement of the Protectorate's programme of social reform. This showed that the Puritans really were puritanical, since it involved not only an assault on swearing, drunkenness and fornication, but also the attempted abolition of such staples of English life as horse races, casinos, theatres and brothels. Not even pubs were exempt. Still worse, from the point of view of the constitutionally minded, was the fact that the major generals were to be paid for by a 10% income tax on ex-royalists, known as the decimation, and levied purely on the authority of the Lord Protector. Such taxation without consent was a red rag to a bull, and when Cromwell, trying to maintain a balancing act between the army and Parliament, summoned the Second Protectorate Parliament in 1653, the decimation tax came under sustained attack. Indeed, so concerned was even this hand-picked Parliament with Cromwell's arbitrary use of power that they sought to redefine his position by recreating the office of king, which they'd abolished so eagerly 4 years previously. They set out their request in this document, the humble petition and advice, which urged Cromwell to exchange the title of Lord Protector for that of King. The title and office of a king, they argued, had long been received and approved by our ancestors, and had not God shown his favour to Cromwell by granting him so many famous victories, might not the royal dignity be the Lord's will? Cromwell was obviously fit to be king, but why should Parliament, which had just killed one king, now seek to create another? The reason was that the powers of a king, unlike those of a Lord Protector, were known and were limited. A king had to respect ancient custom and to seek the consent of Parliament to make law and to raise taxes. King Oliver would have been an altogether more circumscribed figure than Lord Protector Cromwell. But the army was aghast that its godly revolution might amount to no more than the replacement of the House of Stuart by the House of Cromwell. So they lobbied hard against the title of king, and Cromwell himself, after weeks of agonized indecision, decided that God had blasted the title and the name of king. He would accept the powers, and indeed more than the powers, of a king, but not the title. But if Parliament couldn't have a king, at least they could have a sort of coronation. Cromwell's original inauguration had been a sober affair, but on the 26th of June 1657, Cromwell was invested as Protector for a second time here in Westminster Hall. This time there was nothing puritanical about it. Even the royal coronation chair was brought from Westminster Abbey to serve as a centrepiece for what amounted to a secular coronation. Cromwell was invested with a royal robe of purple velvet lined with ermine, a gilt-bound and embossed Bible, a golden-hilted sword, and a massive, solid gold sceptre. He swore a version of the coronation oath, and finally, seated in majesty in this coronation chair, he was acclaimed 3 times to the sound of trumpets and the cry, "God save the Lord Protector." All that was missing was the crown itself, and that appeared on his coinage and his great seal. Oliver was now indeed king in all but name. Cromwell had rid Britain of its king, but now, as Lord Protector, he held more power than any king ever had, and his achievements equalled or even exceeded those of any legitimate English monarch. But just 1 year after his second investiture, Cromwell fell ill, and on the 3rd of September 1658, he died at the royal palace of Whitehall. In Cromwell's magnificent funeral ceremonies, any coyness about his royal status was finally abandoned. Cromwell had ruled like a king. He was to be buried as a king, with solemn ceremony, a vast cortege which included no fewer than 3 state-salaried poets, and at vast expense. Presiding over it all, as was traditional in royal funerals, was a lifelike effigy of Cromwell himself, which wore, in death, the remade imperial crown which he'd refused in life. Few British rulers have left a grander legacy, or one that seemed more stable. On his deathbed, Cromwell had nominated his eldest surviving son, Richard, as his heir, and within 3 hours of his father's death, Richard was proclaimed to the sound of trumpets, Lord Protector by the grace of God. Loyal addresses flooded in from the counties and towns, and messages of condolence and congratulation from foreign sovereigns. Few royal successions have been as smooth. Richard was not without his personal qualities either. He'd been brought up to be a simple country gentleman, spending part of his youth in his father's modest house here in Ely. But as Lord Protector, he went on to display charm, dignity, and even an unexpected eloquence. But he lacked the killer instinct for power on the one hand, and a secure power base in the army on the other. Richard also inherited the unresolved political dispute between the army and Parliament. His father had been strong enough to control it, but it quickly threatened to overwhelm Richard. His first Parliament met in January 1659. But by April, the Council of Officers was calling on Richard to dissolve Parliament and entrust himself to the army. Their intention was to keep Richard in office as a front to their own military rule. Richard, unwilling as he's supposed to have said that one drop of blood should be spilled to preserve his greatness, reluctantly agreed, dissolved Parliament, and threw himself on the mercy of the Council of Officers. But dissension in the ranks quickly thwarted the Council's plans as junior officers and radical Republicans joined together to call for the restoration of the Rump Parliament. The generals were forced to concede, and the Rump reassembled on the 7th of May 1659. The few remaining members immediately voted to turn the constitutional clock back to 1649 and abolish the Protectorate. Richard resigned from office after just 8 months. The reign of Queen Dick, as Richard was derisively known, was effectively over. There was now a vacuum in authority, just as there had been after the execution of Charles I. Once the army would have stepped decisively into the breach, but the army, for the first time, was divided. In London, its leadership was weak, self-interested, and vacillating. In Scotland, however, General George Monk had power and influence enough to decide the situation. Monk was no friend of the independents. In fact, he'd fought on the royalist side in the Civil War until his capture and imprisonment by the parliamentary forces. In exchange for his promise to command a parliamentary army, Monk was released. Now, Monk, the ex-royalist, took action. He decided that England and Britain would never be at peace until the old forms of government were brought back. That certainly meant a parliament. Might it also mean a king? On the 2nd of January 1660, Monk and his army crossed the Tweed and entered England. Once in London, Monk insisted on the readmission to the House of Commons, of the moderate Presbyterian members who'd been forced out by Pride's purge because they'd opposed the trial of Charles I. The political clock had been turned back still further. For the first time, events in England now offered Charles II, still in exile in the Low Countries, real hope. His advisers had been quick to spot the opportunity offered by the split in the army and the rise of Monk, and they'd put out secret feelers to him. But Monk had played a subtle game, so subtle indeed that his real motives still remain debatable. Was he resolved on the restoration of Charles II all along? Or was he open-minded about everything apart from the necessity for constitutional legitimacy? At any rate, Monk kept his contemporaries guessing and hoping long enough to head off the risk of renewed civil war and to let events acquire their own momentum. And it was a momentum as irresistible as the force of nature towards monarchy. In the spring of 1660, the government of England was in a constitutional limbo. There was no king, no protector, and even no parliament, since at Monk's urging, the reconvened parliament had at last voted for its own dissolution. Even Monk's army was self-consciously apolitical. Now, in active collusion with Monk, Charles II offered himself and his kingship as a solution to the power vacuum. He did so in a letter formally addressed to the Speaker of the Long Parliament and named after the town in the Netherlands where it was written. This is the Declaration of Breda, issued by the future Charles II from his place of exile in the Netherlands, and intended to serve both as a manifesto for his restoration and as a blueprint for a comprehensive settlement after the turmoil of 20 years of civil war and unrest. And it shows that the lessons of those years had been well learned. Its principal argument in favour of monarchy is that the proper rights and powers of the king are the guarantor of the rights of everybody else, and that without the king's rights, nothing and no one was safe. It promised to bind up the wounds of a bleeding nation. It offered pardon to all, save effectively those who directly participated in the king's execution. But, most strikingly and unthinkably for the heir of Charles I, it also offered liberty to tender consciences in religion. Was the genie of the royal supremacy, with its fatal harnessing of politics and religion, to be exercised at last? The Declaration of Breda was issued on the 4th of April 1660. On the 25th of April, at General Monk's urging, a new parliament known as the Convention, because it had not been summoned by a king, was elected at last. It was overwhelmingly pro-royalist. Edward Montague, Earl of Manchester, who a decade and a half earlier had opposed the king's trial and execution, was appointed Speaker of the House of Lords, whilst the freely elected Commons was overwhelmingly royalist too. Its first and only task was to discuss the question of restoration. On the 30th of April, the Convention MPs processed to hear a sermon in St Margaret's, Westminster, preached by the Presbyterian Richard Baxter, who, a few years previously, had been so shocked by the religious anarchy of the New Model Army, and entitled A Sermon of Repentance. It argued that both the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians had sinned by fighting each other to establish their exclusive vision of the Church, and that instead they should unite in as comprehensive a national church settlement as possible. His call was heeded, and the next day both sides joined together to vote for the recall of the king. A week later, Charles was proclaimed by both houses. Samuel Pepys recorded, Everybody now drinks the king's health without any fear, whereas before it was very private that a man may do it. Charles II, who'd already been crowned King of Scotland a decade earlier, processed here to Westminster Abbey for his second coronation as King of England on the 23rd of April 1661. It was St. George's Day, and everything was done to restore the traditional forms. The King even revived the eve of coronation procession from the Tower to Westminster, which had been dispensed with by his father and grandfather. The procession took over 5 hours to pass and was of unparalleled magnificence, as was the coronation. All the ancient robes and regalia, which had been deliberately destroyed after the abolition of the kingship, were lovingly recreated as far as possible to the old dimensions and forms. The service followed the text used for his father and grandfather, and at the ensuing coronation banquet held in Westminster Hall, the King's champion flung down his gauntlet in the traditional challenge to fight in single combat any who would deny or gainsay the claim of Charles II to be rightful heir to the imperial crown of England. It was almost as though the Civil War, the Republic, and the Protectorate had never been. Even the political and religious disputes of the 1640s would be revisited once more. But during 2 decades of war and upheaval, important lessons had been learned. Never again would an army be permitted to wield political power in England. And never again would the English seek to resolve their political differences by force. Within a generation indeed, the monarchy would undergo another revolution, but this time gloriously. Not a drop of blood would be spilt.